Well, tonight, or on this Abib 13, which it is this year, we're going to do a presentation on the Last Supper. This will be part 1 of 2. We'll do the next part on Passover Day. And it's kind of an interesting teaching on, well, when was the Last Supper? Or the 13th or some other day. And once again, it is a study from Yah's Covenant Calendar. Of course, the approximate date is Abib in the year of the Crucifixion. And we've been learning a little bit about that particular year. So in this topic about the Last Supper, as I said, that there's 2 parts, part 1 and part 2. And the first part that we're going to do is this controversy over the date of this Last Supper. Was it Abib 13? Was it Abib 14? And here's the other question. Was the Last Supper the Passover meal? I don't know. People that study the Torah should know the answer to that, but lots of them don't. They're new and they don't know the answer. But anyway, part 2 is the next part. And we're going to talk about both types of bread that were at this Last Supper table. But the question is, only one of these breads can represent Yahushua's body, and which one will it be? So there's some interesting things that are coming up. But anyway, tonight, what was the day and the month date? The day and the date of the Last Supper. Is it Abib 13 or Abib 14? And because we're going to find out that there was leavened bread present the evening of the Last Supper, well, that alone would disqualify the supper as the Passover meal that was eaten on Abib 14, the Passover day. Well, that would just make total sense to most people, but some get confused. However, this is only one witness, and we need to find a couple more witnesses. So the question is, what about John 13:1? John should be able to settle this question with no problem at all, and we could go home right now. But anyway, the Gospel of John, he's always got those really interesting answers. He says in chapter 13, verse 1, "Now before the feast of the Passover, when Yahushua knew that his hour was come, that he should depart out of this world unto the Father." That's how it starts out, before the feast of the Passover. Well, verse 1 is pretty plain, stating the timing. It was definitely before the feast of the Passover, which is always on the 14th day of the first month. Passover is. So logic would demand the betrayal of Yahushua must occur before his sacrifice on the cross. And then verse 2, "And supper being ended, the devil having now put into the heart of Judas Iscariot to betray him." Well, in verse 2, John shows that the Last Supper took place on the same night that Judas Iscariot betrayed Yahushua. Well, the question is, if that wasn't the 13th day of the month, when was it? What day or what date? Now, I need to tell you right up front that this study is going to be given according to the dawn day start, and we're going to have a little section on that. And why does it matter when the Last Supper was celebrated as compared to the Passover? Why does this day start have anything to do with it? Well, we're going to ask the question, was this on Abib 13, which was a third cycle or a Tuesday? Was the Lord's Supper on that day? Or the date, was it Abib 14? Was it the fourth cycle and a Wednesday? Or was it neither? Maybe it was neither. So we're going to look at least 3 witnesses, and these will be towards the last part of the study because we have some other things to do ahead of time. So we're going to look at John chapters 13, 18, and 19 for our first witness. We're also going to look at that phrase with desire, I desired. And we will look at a special meal, something about that special meal. But first, we're going to look at Daniel 9:27, and then we're going to do a review of the Synoptic Gospels. Now, I would like to tell you that this is a difficult study. Doing the study on which bread is complicated, but it's easier than this study. So I don't even know of a good way to put this study together, but I just want you to hang on because it's kind of bunny trailed and there's a lot of stuff going on. We're going to be looking at some different Bible versions. So what is this controversy for part one? Well, I'd like you to take a note. If the type of bread could have settled the whole controversy of whether the Last Supper was either Abib 13 or Abib 14, or if it was Tuesday or Wednesday, or maybe even a Thursday, you know what? Our study would be all done. However, there are some other questions to be considered, and I already told you that when the day commences, is it at sunset or in the morning? That makes a big difference in this study. And we're also going to find out, is the day really supposed to commence with the dawn light? And is that Passover meal ever eaten 21 hours in advance of any Passover sacrifice? We're going to be looking at that as well. And you know, the argument is this: if the Passover meal is eaten before the Passover sacrifice even takes place, how in the world is that ever going to align with Torah instructions that are given in Exodus 12? Well, there's a lot of conflicting opinions. What do you think about these different opinions? Number one, Matthew, Mark, and Luke record the Last Supper was eaten on the last night of Yahushua's life. Now, most tend to believe that Matthew, Mark, and Luke record the Last Supper is, guess what? The same as the Passover meal. Most people believe that. Well, I would like to say that it is not the same. They are not the same, but we're going to find out for sure. And number three, John shows clearly that this Last Supper occurred before the Passover feast. So is there any way to reconcile these differing opinions? And you know what? First, we need to consider some facts. We all know that the gospel writers would have followed the Torah. In Exodus 12:6, it says Passover lambs were to be killed between the evenings on Abib 14. And we all know that the Jews have traditionally interpreted between the evenings to mean in the afternoon. Well, we've done a study on that, and it does mean a little bit differently, but that's the way the Jews traditionally interpret it. At the time of Yahushua, the priests sacrificed the Passover lambs in the afternoon of Abib 14. In the book, The Wars of the Jews by Josephus, he records many Passover lambs were slaughtered from the 9th hour till the 11th hour, and that was according to the dawn day. And I would just like to make a note in case anybody is confused. On the Roman clock today, that would be understood as 3 o'clock to 5 o'clock. Or I should say the 9th hour. Yes, the 9th hour is 3 o'clock to 5 o'clock, the 11th hour being the 5 o'clock time in Roman time. Well, let's look at this historical account from Josephus, and this is what he has to say. Just look at the facts that are in here. So these high priests, upon the coming of their feast, which is called the Passover, when they slay their sacrifices from the 9th hour to the 11th, but so that a company not less than 10 belong to every sacrifice, and many of us are 20 in a company, found this number of sacrifices was 256,500, which, upon the allowance of no more than 10 that feast together, amounts to this number of people who are taking part in the Passover: 2,700,200 persons that were pure and holy. Wow, that's a lot of people. Well, let's compare this quote to the prophecy that's given in Daniel 9:27. Is it an accurate prophecy? This is what it has to say. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And in the midst of the week, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. Oh, let's take a look here. Because remember, I told you that these studies have everything to do with the proper commencement of the day. So this chart is according to a dawn day start. And if you start with dawn, the absolute midst of the week is going to be right there where the sun sets, and the Erev, or the evening of the fourth cycle, will come along, and that is the exact middle of the week. And I want you to keep that information in mind as we consider the information in the Gospels. This prophetic account from Daniel is really important. Remember, it says, and he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. So we're going to start with the dawn day right there at the first cycle, and we're going to go 1, 2, 3 into the fourth light season. And you can see there at the 6th hour from dawn, and that would be noon. This is the crucifixion week. Remember what happened on the cross is when the day went dark, got very dark. And Josephus says that the sacrifices were completed by the 11th hour. So that was just before the end of the day season. So according to the day start at dawn, Rev, or the evening, is the 12th hour from dawn. And on the fourth cycle, this is the exact midst of the week. That's where the sacrifices ceased. And that's what Josephus said, that all the sacrifices were done by the 5th hour. And then, of course, we have the night season. And as soon as you have the dawn come, after the night season, that is the beginning of the unleavened bread. So the 12th hour there is also fulfilling the Daniel 9:27 prophecy. Very interesting. So let's take another look at a few other details. Well, Yahusha, could we say that he was a divine corpse? You know what? At the moment of sunset, the 12th hour, the sacrifice of Yahusha terminated. At Erev, or in the evening, Joseph of Arimathea requested and removed his emaciated body from the tree. And at that point, Yahusha was a divine corpse. What for? In waiting, just waiting. Now, I want you to take a little bit of a look at charting sunset according to this Daniel 9 prophecy, and see what happens with the day start. If the day really does commence at sunset and it has these brown bars, we're going to see how these brown bars are going to mark the exact midst of the week, or do they mark the exact midst? Can this option for the midst of the week hour fulfill the Daniel 9:27 prophecy and align with the quote for Josephus? Now, I just want to make a little note here that this Daniel 9 prophecy has 3 different levels of application. It has first level in its historical account, and the second level of application is right here during the time of Yahusha, in the midst of the week. He laid down his life on the middle day of the week. That was a Wednesday, a fourth cycle. It doesn't work any other way to get 3 days and 3 nights. So this fulfillment is what we're talking about, Yahusha's fulfillment for the midst of the week. So here we have our first cycle. You can see that our chart is starting with the darkness, okay? And so we have 7 cycles here. We want to find out, with a sunset day start, do we get to a middle of a week? Well, first of all, we know that a week has 7 days, so 3.5 days should be the absolute midst of the week. Well, let's count out 3.5 days again, because it might be just a little bit of a tricky question. So there's day 1 after that first cycle, and we'll put in, there's day 2, and we'll put in day 3. And look what happens. Here's your half a day. It's at the beginning of the daylight season. Do you see that? We have 24 hours here, 24 on the second cycle, 24 on the third cycle, and then here's your half a day, your 12. That makes 3.5 days, marking that pink bar marks dawn as the 4th day, and it's the middle hour of the whole week. That is the middle of the week when you start with a sunset commencement. Well, the dawn of the 4th cycle as the midst of the week is not when the sacrifices and oblations ceased. We know that at the morning of the Passover day is just when Yahushua was before Pilate. So a sunset day start does not align with Daniel 9:27. There's no way you can make this beautiful prophecy of our Messiah even begin to work. So that's just a little bit on the day start in this section. Well, out of the four Gospels, surely we should be able to find the date for the Last Supper. It just seems like it shouldn't take that much time. And the question is the Last Supper the same as the Passover meal? And if so, which of these statements is true? There's two of them. Listen very carefully. The Passover meal is known as the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Notice those capital letters. The Passover meal is known as the Feast of Unleavened Bread because of the command to eat unleavened bread that evening meal on the 14th. Or statement number two, the Passover meal is known as a Feast of Unleavened Bread because of the command to eat unleavened bread that evening of the 14th. Do you see the difference between these two statements? Are both statements true? Are they both false? Or is one true and one not? Well, we should look at the Synoptic account. Now, these Synoptic Gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke, for those that might not know. And Matthew, Mark, and Luke actually are pretty close in all of their recordings for just about everything that's written there. It's always John that is different. And so we want to look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke and see what's going on. And I'm going to read a lot of this because I want you to hear what's happening. Now, on the first day of the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, the disciples came to Yahushua, saying to him, "Where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover?" And he said, "Go into the city to a certain man and say to him, 'The teacher says, my time is at hand, and I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples.'" So the disciples did as Yahushua had directed them, and they prepared the Passover. And then you will have the events for the Last Supper after that statement. Now, when the even was come, he sat down with the 12, and as they did eat, he said, "Verily I say unto you, that one of you shall betray me." Well, let's just take a little bit of a look at understanding Matthew 26:17. And I want you to see that when we remove the italicized words, the verse can tend to read a little bit differently. Let's just read it. "Now on the first of the unleavened bread, the disciples came to Yahushua, and they said to him, 'Where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover?'" Passover was indeed the first day unleavened bread was eaten, but it was not the first feast day of unleavened bread. It's just a simple concept, but we need to think about it. Now, this is a New King James Version. Matthew says it was the first of the unleavened bread. Is that really when Yahushua held this Last Supper? On the surface, this appears to contradict John's account, which plainly stated that the Last Supper occurred before the Feast of Passover. Let's take a look at Mark 14, verses 12 to 18. And I'm not going to read every word here because we've already read quite a bit of it. But let's read verse 12. "Now on the first day of unleavened bread, when they killed the Passover, his disciples said to him, 'Where do you want us to go and prepare that you may eat the Passover?' And again, he tells them to go out and ask this man for a guest room. And they did. They got this large upper room. Verse 16, "So his disciples went out, and they came into the city and found it just as he had said to them, and they prepared the Passover." Oh, what does that mean? Does that mean they were preparing a lamb? What in the world does that mean? And then, of course, after that, there are the events for the Last Supper, where he's actually sitting down with the 12. And again, he says somebody's going to betray him. Well, it sounds like in Mark, we have the same challenge here. It sounds like the first day of unleavened bread is when that they're preparing this Passover. Well, let's see what we can do with the Gospel of Luke. It's found in Luke 22, 7 to 16. And again, I'll just read some of the verses. Verse 7, then when the day of unleavened bread came, when the Passover must be killed, again, Yahusha sent Peter and John, saying, go and prepare the Passover for us, that we may eat. And so they said, well, where do you want us to prepare it? And again, he gave the instructions to go and find this teacher, disciple, and ask him for the guest room. And so they did. He showed them a large furnished room there in verse 12, and it said, there they made ready. So they went and they found it just as he said to them, and they prepared the Passover. Same thing as what we found in Matthew and Mark. And of course, Yahusha said, with desire, I've desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. We're going to look more at that verse. For I say unto you, I will not any more eat thereof until it be fulfilled in the kingdom of Yahuwah. Well, it looks like Luke is just as challenging as Mark. Who can understand these things? But you know what? We need to take a closer look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke in the New King James Version, okay? Now, I want you to remember that the context is Abib 13, that's what we're saying, and the question is, where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover? In Matthew 26:17, remember, this is from the New King James Version. Now, on the first day of the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, the disciples came to Yahusha. Please take note of the words that are italicized and the words that have capital letters. Let's compare that to Mark 14:12. Now, on the first day of unleavened bread, when they killed the Passover lamb, his disciples said to him, questions? Luke 22:7. Then came the day of unleavened bread, when the Passover must be killed. Does it seem to you that there is a lot of emphasis here on the Feast of Unleavened Bread? Do you see this in Matthew, Mark, and Luke in the New King James Version? Every one of them have unleavened bread capitalized. Even the added word feast has a capital F on it. Well, we should take a look at some other versions too. So we're going to look at Matthew 26:17. And I just have the New King James Version here at the top for your comparison. And then below this colored bar, we're only going to look at two. That's all the time that we have for tonight. We will compare the NIV and we'll compare the scriptures, the 2009 version. The NIV, I want you to compare it to the New King James Version. On the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the disciples came to Yahusha. Almost exactly the same there, only the NIV doesn't give you any italicized words, so you don't know what's been added and what hasn't been added. In the scriptures, it says on the first day of unleavened bread, the taught ones came to Yahusha. Well, in these other versions for Matthew 26:17, is the emphasis still on the Feast of Unleavened Bread? Do you happen to see that? It looks like the emphasis is still on the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Well, we're going to look at Mark 14:12 and carry out this same little assignment. The New King James Version is there on the top so you can compare. And the NIV, look what it says. On the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, all capital letters. The scriptures says on the first day of unleavened bread, when they were slaughtering the Pesach lamb. Well, in these other versions, for Mark 14:12, it looks to me like the emphasis is still on the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Are you surprised? We have Luke 22:7. Let's check Luke out. Compare it to the New King James Version. The NIV, then came the day of unleavened bread, on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. Has anyone read in the Torah where you sacrifice the Passover lamb on the day of unleavened bread? Capital U, capital B. And the scriptures in the 2009 version has basically the same thing. And the day of unleavened bread came when the Pesach had to be slaughtered. I hope that you're wondering what is going on, because here again in Luke 22:7, it really looks to me like the emphasis is on the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Everything seems to indicate the Passover preparations were taking place on the first day of the festival of unleavened bread. You know, something just does not make sense. If the disciples were actually planning preparations for Passover with Yahusha on the first day of the unleavened bread festival, this is definitely not in alignment with the Passover statute commands in Exodus, and I'm pretty sure all of you would agree with me. So let's take a closer look at the King James Version. A closer look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And the context is still, where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover? I know there's a lot of repetition here, but I want you to see what's happening. In Matthew 26:17, look what Matthew has in the King James. The italicized words, I have put them a lot smaller so we can read the verse. Now on the first of the unleavened bread, the disciples came to Yahusha. On the first of the unleavened bread, no capital letters. In Mark, on the first day of unleavened bread, when they killed the Passover. Well, that one still sounds, we should think about that one too. Luke 22:7, then came the day of unleavened bread when the Passover must be killed. Does something look like there's something different going on here with the King James? There isn't as much emphasis on the Feast of Unleavened Bread in the King James this time. Is there more to consider? Were the disciples preparing for a small letter F feast, or a large feast with a capital F, or a capital F with festival? What were they preparing for? Well, we need to check out a few facts to see if there is a difference between three very similar terms. I wonder if there's a difference. So we're watching for a closer examination now for just one day. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they all say this. Matthew says, now on the first day of the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, I'm not going to read everything just to save some time here, but just look what it has to say. In Mark, it also has first day of unleavened bread, but you'll notice up in Matthew that the word day was added. Mark doesn't add day, or they didn't add it in, it was there. So Mark is saying on the first day of unleavened bread, when they killed the Passover, okay? That's what he's saying. And Luke, then came the day of unleavened bread when the Passover must be killed. And that's where Yahusha sent Peter and John out to say, let's go find a place to eat, okay? Nothing seems to be getting solved here very, very quickly, does it? But as we have found, is talking about just one day. It's just a singular day. It's not more than one. Well, there is something to think about. Was that day when they killed the Passover, was that also the day when unleavened bread was eaten the first time? Like, for example, Passover? Or was that first day of the unleavened bread festival? These are different because Passover had unleavened bread eaten on that day, but the unleavened bread festival is the day after. So we're at an important crossroad decision now. We are now at a point where a decision will have to be made. Do we have to choose between the Synoptic Gospels or the book of John? Do we have to side with 3 and leave 1 out, or side with John and toss the other 3? Or, here's another question, would it be better to see all of the Gospels are actually in harmony with one another? Wouldn't that be better? To see all of the Gospels in harmony. But I want to tell you, everyone, this is a really tricky little piece of the puzzle to figure out. You could do probably 100 slides just on this. Let's try to chart these 4 Gospels. We'll start with Matthew 26:17, and I want to read it the way I have written it to see if this will make more sense. Now, as the first of the unleavened bread day was approaching, the disciples came to Yahushua, saying to him, "Where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover?" In verse 17, the context and the time reference is going to be on the third cycle before the Last Supper. Right there, this is when they're actually asking him this question on the third cycle. That would be a Tuesday, the third cycle. Passover is the first day of unleavened bread, and that was approaching. And you can see that down there, they would have had their Passover meal in the evening, just the way it is commanded in Exodus 12. That festival of unleavened bread also has 7 days that were approaching. Is that not true? There were 7 days of unleavened bread that were approaching as a festival. So for me, there is only one way for the Synoptic Gospels to be understood. There were days approaching that were connected to unleavened bread. The context is about the Passover day arriving. The Passover day had unleavened bread eaten on it as well. It was known as a feast of unleavened bread because they did eat unleavened bread for the very first time at that spring festival. It was impossible for the disciples to place this request on either Passover, the fourth cycle, or unleavened bread, the fifth cycle. That just wouldn't even make sense. Well, translations discrepancies, you will find them, and they're there so that you will search things out. Doesn't it say it's to the glory of Yah to conceal a matter and the honor of kings to search it out? Remember that John's gospel was written much later, and it's very likely that the Synoptic Gospels were already translated into Greek by the time that John was reading them. John would have seen the definite necessity to clarify the proper meaning around the word day, especially singular day, the meaning around day of unleavened bread. That's meaning Passover, taking all of his readers right back to what the Hebrew mindset would have originally understood. Now, Tim tells me that if you could read this in Matthew in the Hebrew, it reads a lot different, but to explain it, that's a different thing. And that would be another whole big study. So today, the Greek translation has taken on a meaning that was never intended by any Hebrew writer or believer. So those are some things that we need to be careful about and try to figure out. But next, we're going to look at a very interesting chart. Just a chart of putting some things together about, is it a feast with a small f? Is it a feast with a capital F? Or is it a festival with a capital F? These are all different meanings. In Genesis 19:3, it talks about Lot. And Lot pressed upon them greatly, and they turned in unto him, this is the angels, and entered into his house, and he made them a feast, and he did bake unleavened bread, and they did eat. When you look up feast, it is H4960, Mishtah, and it can mean drink by implication, drinking. Look at this, a banquet where there's feasting and drinking. So this feast that Lot gave, it was just a feast. It doesn't say that it was an annual prescribed feast or an annual festival. It was just a feast of drinking and eating. And of course, at unleavened bread, we assume that was definitely the Passover festival. So for covenant calendar definitions, I want to show you that the full Passover festival includes Passover Day. It includes the Unleavened Bread Festival, and that has 7 days, and it also includes the Wave Sheaf Festival. So Passover Festival, right down here, guess what? This has a feast, and it is the first feast day of unleavened bread in the whole Passover festival. And then after Passover, we have 7 days of unleavened bread where you have feasting of unleavened bread for 7 full days. And of course, within that week of unleavened bread, there is a wave sheaf festival somewhere on one of those days. And guess what? You'll be eating unleavened bread on that day as well. The word shag, 2282, is the word for festival of unleavened bread. You can see that it's a different word number and a different name than this feast up here for what Lot was referring to. It's a different word number and a different word. The festival of unleavened bread has 7 days with a feast each day of unleavened bread. And as I said, that includes the wave sheaf. And all of these three together will give you a full Passover festival that has these three important components. And this is Exodus 12:18 right here, right at that point. So on Abib 13, there at the bottom in that comment, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the disciples asked where to prepare the Passover. For what? For the Abib 14 feast that was a day of unleavened bread that was approaching. That's what they asked him. What shall we do about that? They were understanding that there was a special day approaching that was going to have unleavened bread at a feast. You know, when it comes to the Gospel of John, we've got to pay attention. And especially when you're working between the Gospels, it's really important in many studies that we've got to watch the content of what we're looking at. And we need to watch the context, especially with words like a and the, as these words will cause a difference in the final context. And it's always a good idea to compare some other versions of Scripture. You might see something going on, and then you'll take a little bit of a closer look. Bible versions that have those italicized words and capital letters where they do not belong can lead to a completely different context if you're not paying attention. And we saw that happen tonight. So you need to be sure and check and see what John has to say, especially if you're looking in the Gospels. You need to see what John is saying because he often has the golden key that's going to solve the controversy. We find that happens so many times. Well, we're ready now to start at looking at our witnesses. We have 3 of them. And the first witness for the day and the date of Passover is going to be found in John's Gospel between chapters 13, 18, and 19, because the Synoptic Gospels seem to have some challenging phrases. So we want to examine what's happening in John. Considering John's Gospel, have you ever wondered why there are 4 Gospels for one story? Like I used to wonder that forever. Excuse me, but I know the reason now. It's because it's a calendar. It's a calendar study. There's 4 Gospels because it's all about calendar. And have you ever wondered why John's Gospel is different than the Synoptics? Well, again, I'm going to tell you it's because of calendar. Many scholars believe that John wrote his Gospel late in the 1st century, in fact, decades after the Synoptic Gospels had been written. Greek-speaking Gentiles comprised a significant portion of the assembly, and most of them were believing in that Roman midnight commencement for the day start. They didn't really understand the dawn day start, and of course the Jews were talking about a sunset, so there was a lot of confusion going on. John's Gospel differs from the Synoptic Gospels because of the number of Gentile converts that were pouring into the assembly. He had to include those missed details that would separate the truth from the error, especially when the anti-Jewish bias began to take root. And you know, John went to great lengths to emphasize the Messiah's heritage and to remove all possibilities of lingering doubt, especially around the details of covenant calendar, timing of events, and things like that. So let's review the beginning of John's account of the Last Supper. Let's take a little bit of a tour here. In John 13, verses 1 to 5, let's read this. It says, "Now before the feast of the Passover, when Yahushua knew that his hour was come, that he should depart out of this world unto the Father, having loved his own which were in the world, he loved them unto the end. And only John tells you this, supper being ended. Which supper? Good question. And supper being ended, the devil having now put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him. Yahusha, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he was come from Yahuwah and went to Yahuwah, he riseth from supper, listen, he riseth from supper and laid aside his garments and took a towel and girded himself. And after that, he poureth water into a basin, and he began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel wherewith he was girded. So let's just do a little bit of review about what we just read. Verse 1 plainly states that the timing was before the feast of Passover. He's very clear. And that Passover day is always on the 14th day of the first month. So logic demands the betrayal of Yahusha must occur before his sacrifice on the cross. And in verse 2, John shows the Last Supper took place on the same night that Judas Iscariot betrayed Yahusha. Does this sound very different from the Synoptic Gospels? However, there are some other details that we should note. John's timing of this Last Supper. His timing of the Last Supper is obviously referring to the night of Abib 13. Sadly, and unfortunately, the Synoptic Gospels do not have the same clarity in some areas. So John goes on to reiterate several times that these events took place before Passover. Now, you need to remember that he was the youngest, okay? He must have been poring over those three Synoptic Gospels, poring over them and looking at them to see what in the world was going on. And he couldn't touch them. He couldn't change them because it was the witness of these three men that wrote. So John had to read those Gospels very carefully, and then he had to work it into his Gospel in order to clear up all the confusion. This is just amazing. Point number 4, clearly the Passover meal traditionally eaten on the evening of Abib 14 had not yet been observed. Traditionally, I'm saying that because some would do it on a sunset. They would say the sunset either of Abib 13 started the Passover, but on the real Passover day, the covenant calendar Passover day, they would eat that meal in the evening. But the meal could be eaten at other times as well. This Passover lamb could only be eaten after the Passover sacrifice is slain, bled, skinned, and roasted. And by the way, everybody, that's Torah. You can't eat it before it's sacrificed. There's no possible way. And when you do some of these studies in the Old Testament with the sunset day start, especially in Exodus 12, the Passover lamb there, the Passover of Egypt, and you start charting it on sunset, guess what happens? You're actually eating the sacrifice before it is actually slain. By default alone, this Passover meal could not have been observed by our Messiah, his disciples, or any of the Jews. It's absolutely impossible. Well, we're going to skip some verses. John adds in a lot of detail that we don't need here tonight, but we're going to look at verses 21, 26, and 27, because these are events following the Last Supper and the foot washing. When Yahusha had thus said, he was troubled in spirit and testified and said, Verily, verily, I say unto you, that one of you shall betray me. Yahusha answered, He it is to whom I shall give a sop when I have dipped it. And when he had dipped the sop, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon. And after the sop, Satan entered into him. And then said Yahusha unto him, That thou doest, do quickly. We're going to do more on this piece of the puzzle in part 2. These events can only occur on the night season of Abib 13, the day before Passover on Abib 14. Let's continue in John, verses 28 to 30. Now, no man at the table knew for what intent he spake this unto him. For look what it says, some of them thought, because Judas had the bag, that Yahusha had said unto him, buy those things that we have need of against the feast, or that he should give something to the poor. He then, having received the sop, went immediately out, and look what John has to say. And it was night, right there. Once Judas left, Yahusha gave his last words to the remaining 11 disciples. In chapters 14 to 17, you're going to find about 3,000 words that are not recorded in the Synoptic Gospels. Only John talks about this. But I want you to look at verse 29. And did you catch the calendar lingo? The disciples thought, Yahusha said, buy those things. This is obviously not the night of the 14th, because he is still with them. We need to pay attention to all these very interesting details. Well, John has a whole bunch more. We're just going to review them on this one slide. Between chapters 14 to 17, like I said, he's the only gospel writer that records many additional instructions from Yahusha to his disciples from the time that Judas left the group until they went to the Garden of Gethsemane. You'll find this in chapter 14, where he reveals the Father and the promise of the Helper would come to them. In chapter 15, he talks about the lessons of the vine and the branches, and also about the coming rejection. And then in chapter 16, he talks about the work of the Ruach. And of course, chapter 17, we all know that Yahusha's famous prayer for himself and for others. A lot of important details there. But let's consider 3 examples of details in John's gospel that are not found in the Synoptic Gospels. Now, this is only 3 that apply to this particular study, because there's many, many examples. But number 1 is John 18:28. And I have a feeling that when we get done with this study tonight, you're going to find that John is going to be extra, extra interesting after this. John 18:28 has this to say, then they led Yahusha from Caiaphas to the praetorium, and it was early morning. But they themselves did not go into the praetorium, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. Now, they're talking about here the Passover that started that evening on the lunar calendar. But guess what? Who is this they? Who is that? That is no one else but the unbelieving Jews that are on the lunar calendar. They were not going to be defiled, okay? And this early morning, it's in the context of the Passover day. John's already done a lot of work here, and he's talking about the very early hours of the Passover day. Now, some of you might remember that John records all of the Passion events with the Roman reckoning of time, and that starts the day at the beginning of midnight. Therefore, the early morning in this particular verse is correct for both dawn and sunset day starts and the Roman reckoning timing. It works for all 3 of them. And just to let you know that John does use the dawn day in the rest of his gospel. It's just for the Roman reckoning of time is used for the Passion events. But I want you to notice that no one had eaten the Passover meal yet. They were still waiting to eat that meal. The number 2 important detail is found in John 19:14, and John 19:31 is going to be number 3. And I dare say these are Tim's favorite verses. So just pay attention to them. Look at what it has to say in John 19:14. Now it was the preparation of the Passover. Remember, we're doing Roman time, and it says about the 6th hour. This is Roman reckoning of time from midnight, so that would be 6 in the morning, when Pilate said to the Jews, behold your king. Now, do you remember that the Synoptic Gospels count the 6th hour from dawn day start? And when you look in Matthew, Mark, and Luke in those scriptures, you'll find that the 6th hour ends at the hour of noon, when the sun was darkened till the 9th hour. It tells you that the sun became dark at the 6th hour. Well, that aligns perfectly with John, because he's telling you that the 6th hour on Roman reckoning is the dawn of the Passover day. It's very interesting. Now, this is a very interesting verse as well, John 19:31. Therefore, because it was the preparation, this is the 14th, that the body should not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, and that Sabbath would be the first unleavened bread Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day, the Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken, that they might be taken away. Now, it's really interesting here that John is the only gospel writer to verify the high Sabbath is the first Sabbath of unleavened bread. Nobody else talks about that. There is no indication that a high Sabbath has to be 2 Sabbaths on one day, like a feast Sabbath and a weekly Sabbath on one day. That's what tradition teaches that. That is not true. The one and only high Sabbath of the whole year is always the first Sabbath of unleavened bread, and that's it. Not the 7th Sabbath, not the 2nd Sabbath of unleavened bread, only the first. And we'll look at this high Sabbath observance in the book of the covenant in Exodus 12:16-17. On the first day, it's talking about the unleavened bread of the 15th day of the first month. On the first day, there shall be a holy convocation. And on the 7th day, there shall be a holy convocation for you. No manner of work shall be done on them, except that which everyone must eat. That only may be prepared by you. There's a clue there. You can prepare food on a feast Sabbath. So you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, for on this same day I will have brought your armies out of the land of Egypt, and there you shall observe this day throughout your generation as an everlasting ordinance. Well, that's from Book of the Covenant, but guess what? The command is also found in Leviticus 23, which is in the Book of the Law. And on the 15th day of the same month, which is Abib, is the Feast of Unleavened Bread to Yahuwah. 7 days you must eat unleavened bread, and on the first day you shall have a holy convocation. You shall do no customary work on it. So that's the high Sabbath in the Torah. Well, John has some clarity with details when you start to look at him, and you can see that he will point out repeatedly that the Last Supper and the betrayal by Judas and Yahushua's arrest and the beginning of his trials all occurred before the Passover cycle of Abib 14. Therefore, the Last Supper also occurred on the day before the Passover. In John 19:31, it shows with certainty that the day following the Passover preparation day was the annual high Sabbath, that first day of unleavened bread, and it was always on Abib 15. Remember, the definition of a high Sabbath is not an annual feast Sabbath that falls on the weekly Sabbath. Yahuwah commanded the Israelites to observe this high Sabbath every single year. Well, let's just do a little semi-review. The synoptic accounts of the Last Supper, it will tell us that the disciples came to Yahushua on Abib 13. Number 2, they asked him where he wanted them to prepare to eat the Passover meal, which would normally occur the next night on Abib 14. And at least it appears that these disciples, listen here, assumed that they would be eating the Passover meal with Yahushua again. They didn't realize that he would be taken from them. Number 3, Yahushua instructed Peter and John how to find the place where they should prepare to eat the Passover on the night of Abib 14. That is because they thought they would be eating the meal together, okay? He then told them the owner of the house would show them the large furnished upper room, and Mark and Luke both state that it was there in that room that they were to prepare for the Passover meal to be eaten. You'll see the references there in Mark and in Luke. Well, after the supper, we're going to see what happens early the next day. The following synoptic testimonies follow the events of the Last Supper, which is going to be the next morning. I just want to read them to you because maybe this will all come together as we go through this. Matthew 27, when the morning was come, all the chief priests and elders of the people took counsel against Yahusha to put him to death. And when they had bound him, they led him away and delivered him to Pilate. And in Mark 15, it says, and straightway in the morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and the scribes and the whole council, and bound Yahusha and carried him away and delivered him to Pilate. And then in Luke 23:1, and the whole multitude of them arose and led him unto Pilate. And I want to just mention, Luke has no details of the morning. Sometimes he has extra details, sometimes he doesn't. But typically, the Passover meal is to be eaten the evening of Abib 14, after that sacrifice, according to the Torah statutes, not the evening before on the 13th, about 21 hours before the sacrifice. And that's the way it's done with those that are keeping the sunset. They start their 14th on the sunset of the 13th, and that's when they traditionally do their meal. Well, what in the world does this information have to do with the Last Supper? John has more details of what happened early on Abib 14. John says they led Yahusha from Caiaphas onto the hall of judgment, and it was early, and they themselves went not into the judgment hall, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. Remember, we talked about this word they on a couple slides ago. So the question is, who is being referred to as they? Is it the Pharisees and the unbelieving Jews? Is it other disciples? Well, whoever it was, the Passover meal had not been eaten yet, neither by the Pharisees or any disciples at the Last Supper the night before. Nobody had eaten a Passover meal yet. In John 18:28, he said it was early when Yahusha was led from Caiaphas to Pilate. Well, how early was it? Oh, you know, John 19:14 is a very special verse. I love it. Let's read it again. Now it was the preparation of the Passover, and about the 6th hour. Remember, this is about 6 o'clock in the morning with Roman reckoning. And this is when Pilate said to the Jews, behold your king. Right here, John's specific timing is about 12 hours after the Last Supper, and at least another 12 hours to a Passover meal. Let me read that again. John's very specific timing right here is 12 hours after the Last Supper, and at least another 12 hours to a Passover meal on the 14th. Just a note for the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew and Mark record Yahusha was led to Pilate early in the morning, marking the Passover of Abib 14. And along with Luke, their record of the 6th hour is when the sky became darkened, hiding the sacrificial Messiah. Well, it looks like the timing of the 4 Gospels is finally perfectly synchronized. It looks like something is finally coming together. And like I said, this is a really tricky part. Now that the Gospels have been aligned where it seems they did not agree, let's examine an area where the Synoptic Gospels do agree about 12 hours after the Last Supper. And the topic is, do the Gospel writers agree that a new day begins with sunset or with the morning? So there are places where the Gospels do agree. And when we find that, oh, we're happy because it's not as hard to break open the puzzle. So let's see, where do these Gospels agree? These 4 testimonies all follow the events of the Last Supper, the ones that I'm going to give you here on the slide. Typically, that Passover meal would be eaten the evening of Abib 14, but by that time, Yahusha had already laid down his life. So what does Matthew have to say? And when the even was come, the even, this is after sunset. So let me read it this way. After sunset, there came a rich man of Arimathea named Joseph, who also himself with Yahusha's disciple And he went to Pilate and he begged the body of Yahusha. Did you see what that said? At the even, when the even was come, after sunset is when he went and begged for the body of Yahusha. So no, he wasn't in the tomb before sunset. Mark 15, 42 to 43, this is a thumbs up. Really excellent scripture. Mark and John have more incredible detail that are going to solve puzzle pieces in calendar than any of the other two gospels out of the four. Mark and John are always the best. This is what he says. And now when the even was come after sunset, because it was the preparation. So sunset came and it was still the preparation. This is talking about Passover preparation. And then he clarifies it. He says that is the day before the Sabbath. This is talking about the high Sabbath, the unleavened bread Sabbath. And this is when Joseph, an honorable counselor, which also waited for the kingdom of Yahuwah, came and went in boldly unto Pilate and craved the body of Yahusha. So you can see sunset day start is completely obliterated right there in the Gospel of Mark. His verse is the absolute best. So you see, John didn't have to change anything there. Mark already had it figured out. In Luke 23, and that day was the preparation, and the Sabbath drew on. This is talking about the unleavened bread Sabbath. And the women also, which came with him from Galilee, followed after and beheld the sepulchre and how his body was laid. Very, very good explanation that the preparation day was still the Passover, just before the light of the unleavened bread Sabbath. No sunset there, no sunset to change the day there. And then, of course, John 19:31, it's such a favorite verse. Let's read it again. The Jews, therefore, because it was the preparation that the body should not remain upon the cross on the Sabbath day, for that Sabbath was a high day, besought Pilate that their legs might be broken, that they might be taken away. Now, I just want to say something right here. Okay, we have already talked about two different groups of Jews. Okay, where it says here in John 19, the Jews, because it was the preparation day, okay, these Jews understood which day it was because they knew that the day after Yahusha's Passover was going to be covenant calendar, unleavened bread, Shabbat, okay? So these Jews are believing Jews. These are not unbelieving Jews, okay? That makes a difference. You have to look at the context. Well, what does all this information have to do with the Last Supper? Well, this is going to be a very interesting chart. Hang on to your seat. Because the Gospels agree on a Passover point that is really important. One example is the Gospels agree that the day begins in the morning with dawn, okay? Not at sunset, not at midnight, not at sunrise. Why? Because the even of the Passover day does not change the date to Abib 15. We have the 11th day, the 12th day, the 13th day. This was the day of the Last Supper. Last Supper here was right at the end of the 13th day. So let's just watch what we have here. The dawn day begins Passover. Right here at the end of the 13th day, at the end of the Last Supper, as the day was dawning, that's where the Passover day began. And you all know already that there was darkness at the 6th hour. Yahusha was on the cross and the sun went dark. And what does it tell us in the three Synoptic Gospels? That at the 9th hour, everything was accomplished. It was at the 9th hour that Yahusha laid down his life. John doesn't record this, but the three Synoptics do. The next point is that the 12th hour begins the Erev, or the evening portion of that day cycle. So right here, this is the marker for the Erev. This is on the 4th cycle of the week, a Wednesday. Right in the middle is where Erev splits the week in half, right in the midst of the week. Now, I want you to pay attention here. Mark 15 says, the even was come. It's still the Passover preparation day. It's the day before the Sabbath on the 15th. Matthew 27 says, when the even was come, the even's right here on this bar, this orange bar. When the even was come, Joseph asked Pilate for the body right here. It's where Joseph asked. It was already after sunset. And John 19 says, it was the preparation day, the day before the high Sabbath. Right there, it is still Abib 14. And Luke 23 says, that day was the preparation and the high Sabbath drew on. He doesn't say high Sabbath. I'm putting that in there because we already have it from John. But the high Sabbath was drawing on and it was approaching with the light of dawn. So right there at the end of the night season, where the dawning of the unleavened bread begins to come, is the Sabbath, the first Sabbath of unleavened bread. All these events agree. It's really interesting. All four Gospels absolutely agree on these wonderful, wonderful points. Well, let's compare some other Bible commentators to see if they have anything to say about this meal that was called the Last Supper. It's kind of interesting to look at some of the other commentators once in a while. Not that we ever go there first, but it's nice to see if there's anybody that agrees with what the Gospels really teach. And this is Jacob Neusner. In his translation of the Jewish Mishnah, we can see why the disciples would have been concerned with preparing for the Passover the evening of the 13th, even though the Passover meal wouldn't be eaten until the next night. In his quote from Peshaim 1:3, please remember that he's writing with the understanding that Abib 14 begins at sunset on Abib 13. And by the way, Peshaim is the third tractate of the Seder Moed of the Mishnah and of the Talmud. It is concerned mainly with the laws of the Jewish holiday Passover, as well as the Passover lamb offering, and that's from Wikipedia. I just would like to make a note that even though Neusner is using the reasoning that Abib 14 begins the evening before, in his context, he is speaking of de-leavening and possibly anointing that chosen room so that it would be clean from all questionable activity in the past. So that rented room might have even needed a good spring cleaning. So let's look at his quote from Peshaim 1, verse 3. It's very interesting what this has to say about the removal of all leaven, and I wonder what you're going to say when I get done reading this. Anyway, let's read it. This is what our Judah says. They seek out leaven, number 1, on the night of the 14th. Now remember, that's sunset of the 13th, okay? They seek it out on the night of the 14th, or they seek it out on the 14th in the morning, and number 3, at the time of removal. Second one, and the sages say, if one did not seek out leaven on the night of the 14th, remember, that's after sunset on the 13th, guess what? He can seek it out on the 14th. And if he did not seek it out on the 14th, let him seek it out at the appointed time. And this is 11 in the morning till 12 noon on the 14th. And if he did not seek it out at the appointed time, let him seek it out after the appointed time to nightfall. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, they just changed the rules however they wanted. So it's kind of fun to look around and see what others have to say. The New Unger's Bible Dictionary has some interesting information. Unger confirms how the Jews prepared for the observance of the Passover. This is what he has to say. On the evening of the 13th of Nisan, which until that of the 14th was called the preparation for the Passover, every head of a family searched for and collected by the light of a candle all the leaven. Before beginning the search, he pronounced the following benediction. Blessed art thou, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who hast sanctified us with thy commandments and hast enjoined us to remove the leaven. And after the search, he read, whatever leaven remains in my possession, which I cannot see, behold, it is null and accounted as the dust of the earth. So if they missed some, they had a way out. They just said that little prayer. Well, let's just read a little bit more about preparing the Passover. And this is the Greek number 2090. What does this phrase really mean? This phrase, prepare the Passover, because it's found in Matthew 26, Mark 14, and Luke 22. And it comes from the Greek phrase hetomeazan to pasha. According to the Strong's Concordance, the Greek verb root hetomezo means, it actually means to make ready, to prepare, to make the necessary preparations and get everything ready. This is drawn from the Oriental custom of sending persons on before kings on their journeys to level the roads and guess what? To make them passable. Clearly, one of the reasons the disciples questioned Yahusha about where they were going to eat the Passover meal was because Exodus 13:7 Torah statute states, neither shall there be any leaven seen with thee in all thy quarters. No leaven, none whatsoever. Well, what does the phrase really mean? We need to find that out. The night the Passover meal was eaten, the Israelites followed the command to remove all leaven from their dwelling places. Remember Exodus 12:18? In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at even, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at even. So if you just take a quick note, you'll see that unleavened bread was eaten on a total of 8 days. Count it on your fingers, 14 to 21. It'll end up being 8, not 7. And there was a penalty that was prescribed for eating leavened bread during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It says in verse 15, for a 7-day period shall you eat matzos, but on the previous day, or the preparation day, you shall nullify the leaven from your homes. For anyone who eats leavened food, that soul shall be cut off from Israel from the first day to the 7th day. Let's just take a little bit of a break here. How could the disciples not understand what was going on? When the disciples questioned Yahusha about where they were going to eat the Passover meal the next night, or Abib 14, they still did not fully understand that his life would be laid down by then. You know, the Messiah would not be able to eat the Passover lamb or a Passover meal because he was destined to be sacrificed as the Passover lamb within the next day. But you know, Yahusha did not cause undue grief. I just love this about him. He had told them he told them at least 3 times that he was setting his face towards Jerusalem and he was going to die to lay down his life as the sacrifice. But for some reason, the disciples just did not get it. I don't know if they didn't hear it or if they didn't understand it or if they just didn't even hear it. But instead of explaining to them again that he would be in the process of being buried when the time came to eat the Passover meal, you know what he did? Yahusha simply told his disciples where to prepare to eat the Passover meal. After all, that's what they wanted to hear, as they did not seem to hear or comprehend that he had already told them many times that he was going to Jerusalem to die. They just didn't understand. They didn't understand the Torah quite as well as they should have. So Yahusha used their final meal together on Abib 13 to gather his disciples together and to instruct them for one last time before his death. Just imagine if they would have actually figured out that he was going to die, they probably wouldn't have listened to these instructions. They would have been so busy thinking about something else. So, well, what else did Yahusha provide? After Judas left the group, Yahusha provided many final instructions to his friends. Remember, John records them all. It's likely the disciples knew that they were gathering together on the evening of the 13th to receive some special teachings or instructions, as was very common with a rabbi and his followers before the feast season began. Yahusha did give instructions to be remembered forever after, just as he showed them, which to this day is also a kag. I guess you have to say it that way. Well, what else did Yahusha provide? He did so many things for them on that night. Was there something else that was really interesting? Is it possible Yahusha provided this Last Supper room as he knew the disciples would have need of it for the very next day after the Passover? Even though they thought that they would be using the room for another purpose, he knew that they would need a room. I think Yahusha chose this room from one of his believers where he knew that his disciples would be safe from the Jews, those unbelieving Jews who would be seeking after them. Is it possible that this is the room where Yahusha met them on his wave sheaf appearance? What do you think? So let's just do a summary of this first witness about the day and the date. From Daniel 9:27, we know that the crucifixion was on Wednesday. The Last Supper was the day before. So what was the day? Simply, it was the day before on a Tuesday. That's easy to figure out. And we know Passover is always on Abib 14. And that Last Supper was the day before, and it was not a Passover meal. So the date was the 13th when they had the Last Supper. That's not hard to figure out. So that's the answer to our first witness. We're now ready to look at the second witness for the study on the day and the date. And we're going to be looking at this phrase, with desire I have desired. And what is the true intent of this phrase that is going to be found in Luke 22:15-16? A lot of people have a bit of trouble with this phrase, so we need to understand it. Let's read it first. He said unto them, with desire I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I say unto you, I will not any more eat thereof until it be fulfilled in the kingdom of Yahuwah. What does this phrase really mean? With fervent desire, I have desired to eat this Passover. With desire, I have desired. You know, Luke 22:15 has been used to support the assertion that the Messiah and his disciples ate a meal called the Passover meal. Is this so? In this scripture, Yahusha says, with fervent desire, I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. This Greek phrase translated with fervent desire, I have desired, is epithumia, epithumesa. It literally means with desire, I desired. Or in the Strongs, you will see that it says a longing, especially for something that is forbidden. It's a longing. Well, what does the dictionary of the New Testament, the exegetical dictionary, have to say? The first word of this phrase is a noun. Epithumia is a noun. According to this dictionary, usually this word has the ambivalent sense of desire, strive for, long to have, to do or be something. And it can also be used for forbidden desire. That's interesting. Well, Yahusha uses epithumia in this sense in Luke 22:15. He desired it, but he knew that he couldn't have it. Let's look at Farrar Fenton and his translation. He accurately captures the meaning of Yahusha's words in these verses. From Luke 22 again, let's read them. And he said unto them, I have longingly desired to eat this Passover with you before my suffering. However, I tell you that I shall not eat of it until it is administered in the kingdom of Yahuwah. Do you see the clarity in this verse that the Last Supper is not the Passover? But Yahusha had asked them to prepare the Passover, knowing full well that they were not going to be eating it anyway. This is just another clarification to show that the Last Supper was not on Abib 14, and it was not the Passover meal. It was eaten on Abib 13. I like that way to explain it. Well, this is a review for this second witness of the day and the date. Yahusha's desire to eat the Passover will only be realized in the kingdom in this account. And the day that he said this was on the third cycle, a Tuesday. That was at the Last Supper. Therefore, that day and the date of the Last Supper, it was not the Passover meal on Abib 14. The date was absolutely Abib 13. That's the second witness. Well, that should all be cleared up, but why don't we just do a little bit more? We have a third witness for this day and date, and it's talking about a very special meal. This is something that's kind of interesting as well. Could the last gathering of Yahusha and his disciples have been a special preparatory meal? Well, David Stern is a Jewish scholar, and he writes about the Last Supper meal. Let's see what he has to say. The Last Supper is considered by most scholars to have been a Passover meal or a Seder. Many Pesach themes are deepened, reinforced, and given new levels of meaning by events in the life of Yahusha, the Messiah, and by his words on this night. However, Joseph Shalom has suggested that it may not have been the Seder, but a Sudat Mitzvah, the celebratory banquet accompanying performance of a commandment such as a wedding or Brit Milah. Isn't that interesting? Something else is going on here. So here is the background for his argument. When a rabbi and his students finish studying a tractate of the Talmud, okay, or it could be the Torah, but this is what he says, Talmud, they celebrate with a Sudat Mitzvah. It's also called a banquet of completion or graduation. The fast of the firstborn, expressing gratitude for the saving of Israel's firstborn sons from the 10th plague, has been prescribed for the day before Pesach, Nisan 14. He's referring now, of course, to the sunset of Nisan 13. Let me read that again. The fast of the firstborn, expressing gratitude for the saving of Israel's firstborn sons from the 10th plague, has been prescribed for the day before Pesach or Nisan 14, at least since Mishneh times. When it is necessary to eat a Sudat mitzvah, this takes precedence over a fast. With a modicum of foresight, a rabbi can plan to complete a tractate on Nisan 14 and thus avoid having to fast. Doing so is not construed as cheating, and in fact, it has become the custom. Now, when they say complete it on Nisan 14, they're talking about sunset on Nisan 13, okay? So they can complete it by then. So that's very, very interesting what's going on there. In fact, would that be like making up your own rules? You can do whatever you want. Anyway, it's just some interesting information. Well, let's just continue with Stern's quote. The tradition of the fast of the firstborn dates at least from Mishnaic times, but Shalom reasons if it goes back a couple of centuries more to the time of Yahusha, and if the Sadat mitzvah custom applied in the first century to the completing of any course of study, then Yahusha might have arranged to have himself and his Talmudim finish reading a book of the Tanakh on Nisan 14. Or, since Yahusha knew he was going to die, he may have regarded it as appropriate to complete his disciples' earthly course of study with a banquet. Well, this solution would also resolve the perceived conflict between John and the Synoptic Gospels over the timing of the Last Supper. And that's what he has to say. And do you see that? He has conflict there. He's picking up that there's a conflict between the Synoptic Gospels and John. Well, we're trying to solve that conflict. There cannot be any conflict, that's for sure. Let's look at the Companion Bible. It has a comment also on Luke 22:15, and Bullinger states that the Last Supper that Yahusha and his disciples ate was not the eating of the lamb, but the Chagagah, or feast, which preceded it. He goes on to explain that it follows, therefore, that the Lord being crucified on the preparation day could not have eaten of the Passover lamb, which was not slain until the evening of the 14th of Abib, and that would be, or the afternoon. Thus, it is clear, he says, that no Passover lamb could have been eaten at the Last Supper on the previous evening. And what do we have to say? Bullinger knows Yahusha's statutes very, very well. No lamb at the Last Supper? Really? None of the four Gospels mentions a lamb being eaten at the Last Supper. The time had come to slay the Passover when the Messiah and his disciples ate their last meal together. I should say the time had not come. Not had come, it had not come. In addition, the verses of Deuteronomy 16 are Torah instructions for the sacrifice of the Passover lamb. In fact, the first 8 verses are all about this. And even after the Last Supper, were the disciples still intending to follow through with the Torah guidelines for Passover? That was their intention. They were going to do it. Well, let's look what it has to say in Deuteronomy 16. Thou shalt therefore sacrifice the Passover unto Yahuwah thy Elohim of the flock and the herd in the place which Yahuwah shall choose to place his name there. Thou mayest not sacrifice the Passover within any of thy gates, which Yahuwah thy Elohim giveth thee. But at the place which Yahuwah thy Elohim shall choose to place his name in, listen up, there thou shalt sacrifice the Passover. When? It could be at even. That's one. It could be at the going down of the sun. And we've talked about this in the studies on Between the Evenings. This is actually the phrase at high noon of when the sun starts to go down. So this sacrifice could be given or offered sometime in the mid-afternoon, or it could be offered at the season that they came forth out of Egypt. And we've already done that study. That season was the night season when all of the Hebrews sacrificed the Passover lamb in Exodus 12. It was definitely night. But we need to note at the Last Supper, Yahusha had to show the disciples that no more sacrifices were necessary after this new covenant confirming meal that institutes new ordinances. And soon they would understand the reason for such a huge change given on Abib 13, the very day before Passover. Yes, the instructions from Moses were very explicit regarding the proper place to sacrifice the Passover. They were not allowed to sacrifice it anywhere they wanted to, but only in the place where Yahuwah chose to put his name. And during Yahusha's life, it was the temple in Jerusalem where the place was commanded to sacrifice the Passover. And that's where the priests sacrificed the Passover lambs in accordance to this command. The Synoptic Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke absolutely do not conflict with John's account of the Last Supper when they're understood correctly. A careful study of all 4 Gospels shows that Yahusha and the disciples did not eat the commanded Passover meal during this last time together before Yahusha died on his Passover, because no one can eat the Passover lamb or Passover meal on Abib 13 before it is sacrificed and roasted on Abib 14. They simply prepared for the upcoming Passover festival, fully intending to partake of a Passover meal the next day on Abib 14. So let's just do a little bit of a review. At the Last Supper, the disciples could have eaten some type of celebratory or preparatory meal in Yahusha's presence that evening of Abib 13. It was at that supper that Yahusha, who is our high priest of the Melchizedek order, it was at that supper that he establishes the new way to celebrate the Passover without a lamb through these very simple symbols of the bread and the wine. And then he also endorsed the foot washing. But I want you to note that Yahusha did not partake of these symbols. We'll do more on that in part 2. After the meal and after the foot washing activity, Yahusha once again, he sat at that table to instruct his disciples and give another clue that there was a betrayer in the group. Yes, the next clue was that the betrayer would receive the sop. This is when Judas Iscariot arose and he left after he received the sop, and that illustrates the removal of leaven from the group to carry out his plan to betray Yahusha to the Jewish authorities. We'll do more on that in part 2. would it not seem appropriate for Yahusha to use leavened sop to designate the leavened disciple in the group that was soon to betray him? Have you ever thought about that? In conclusion, Yahusha and his disciples obviously could not have eaten a Passover lamb with their meal the night of Abib 13. The scriptures through Paul clearly state that the Messiah was our Passover. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record that Yahusha died at the ninth hour, that's 3 o'clock Roman reckoning of time, and that coincides with the same time as recorded by Josephus for when the slaughter of the Passover lambs commenced. Yahusha fulfilled the symbolism of the Passover lamb by giving his life on the covenant calendar of Abib 14, and no future Passover lambs had to ever be sacrificed again. And now, some of you are going to know the answer to this last question. Do you know why there was no Passover sacrifice on the counterfeit Abib 14 of the unbelieving Jews? Some of you that have been following the covenant calendar studies will know the answer to that question. Let's just look a little bit at the fast of the firstborn, because there's been considerable discussion on who ate what and on what day was it in this section. So what do we know for sure? Well, there was no lamb at the Last Supper. The disciples partook of the bread and the wine, and those were emblems of Yahusha's body. There is no record that Yahusha partook of these emblems, and there's no reason for him to do so in the first place. However, we want to remember that he began his ministry with fasting, and he fasted many times up to his Passover sacrifice that would fulfill the Torah type. Point number 5, it is understood that the lamb chosen on Abib 10 for the Passover sacrifice was fasted for the last 4 days of life. Because Yahusha fulfills all the types, that he would also fulfill the fasting requirement as the Passover lamb. Let's say the Passover lamb, he's the one of the whole universe. Could it be that if this Last Supper was a celebratory meal, that he would have been fasting anyway? He certainly did qualify for the fast of the firstborn, even if it is only a tradition. Yahusha would fast often during his full ministry. Why? Because he knew he would soon face a great deal of temptation. Certainly, this was the case for the upcoming events at his Passover, and I say there is no doubt that he was fasting. Some questions. Is it possible? Is it possible that the disciples would not think anything unusual about Yahusha fasting again, as they would have observed him fasting many times throughout his ministry? And if that is the case, then the Last Supper was very likely a celebration of finishing their practicum with their master. And in that case, the supper definitely was not the Passover meal, and it did not take place on Abib 14. That's absolutely for sure. Yes, the Synoptic Gospels can be reconciled with John. Therefore, when the topic of this study is approached with an open mind and the belief that the scriptures cannot be broken, we can reconcile all of these accounts, because John 10 says the scripture cannot be broken. An epilogue, the Last Supper celebration on Abib 13, it was the last time the disciples were together with Yahusha before he died. It is highly unlikely that any of the disciples ate a Passover meal during the evening of Abib 14 under these surprising circumstances. However, there is something they did do, and that was they locked themselves behind barred doors for fear of the Jews. In fact, they were still there by the evening of the first day of the week, or wave sheaf, as noted by John. In John 20:19, then the same day at evening, being the first of the week, when the doors were shut, where the disciples were assembled for fear of the Jews, came Yahusha, and he stood in the midst, and he said unto them, "Peace be unto you." You know, even though they missed that Passover meal on this Abib 14, Would they have celebrated Passover in the second month? That's something to think about too. Maybe there's no reason, but Torah does provide that option if the first Passover is missed. I just wanted to make that little point there. So for our third witness, we're just going to summarize it. This is the final answer for the day and the date. The Last Supper was special, and it could have followed the tradition of a celebration meal with the master. And the day, it was absolutely the third cycle, a Tuesday. There's no getting out of that. And point number B, therefore, this banquet would not have been a Passover meal on Wednesday, Abib 14. It took place on Tuesday, Abib 13. And that is the final answer. Well, we have one more part to go on the Last Supper. It will be part 2. What kind of bread was at the table of the Last Supper? Was it leavened or unleavened, or was it both? Maybe it was both. And if it was both, which one represents Yahusha? Well, we would just like to invite you to come and see, and we'll be doing that in part 2 on the next day. It will be Passover day. And we just like to tell you that be ready, because it will be an easier study. Paul has some instructions on the Last Supper and the new Passover ordinances in 1 Corinthians. He says, for I have received of Yahusha that which also I delivered unto you, that Yahusha the same night in which he was betrayed took bread, and when he had given thanks, he brake it, and he said, take, eat, this is my body, which is broken for you. This do in remembrance of me. After the same manner also he took the cup, when he had supped, saying, this cup is the New Testament in my blood. This do ye, as oft as you drink it, in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you do show Yahusha's death till he come. And the wedding supper is next. It will be a celebratory meal for the everlasting covenant. That's when he will meet with us again, and his desire will be fulfilled. Well, I'd just like to thank everybody for sitting through this presentation. And if you have any questions and comments, you can send them to questions@studythecalendar.com, and you can find the study at studythecalendar.com as well. And I just hope that you enjoy it. And now you have the answers for what day was the Last Supper eaten, and was it Passover? No, it wasn't. It was not a Passover meal.